Good morning. It's American Literature, Topics in American Literature, the American Mixtape class with Mr. Smith, spring 2022. And we've got a couple of weeks on Detroit and we've got 3 different Detroit guests coming on the call in the next 2 weeks. And so here's a map of Detroit, just so you guys have a sense of the geography. One of the things that's wild is that little green kind of part separated by water in the bottom right-hand corner of the map. That's Canada. So Canada was to my south. It's just a little tiny nook of Canada. Most of Canada is definitely to the north, but a little tiny nook of Canada called Windsor, Ontario, is just to the south of me in Metro Detroit. I grew up in an inner suburb called Southfield. I went to Southfield High School, graduated in 1986. It was a very integrated and mixed suburb when I was there. It's predominantly African-American today. Some of the issues of de facto segregation between blacks and whites is a topic of our text this week. But the inner city of Detroit is predominantly African-American. And I moved, and you may have heard of a hip hop star, Eminem. I mean, he was just in the Super Bowl a couple of days ago. He had a movie record called 8 Mile. 8 Mile was the perimeter. And I lived at 9 Mile. So I grew up at 9 Mile, and I crossed 8 Mile, and I moved downtown after high school. And I lived in the neighborhood where this novel takes place between the years of 1987 and 1994. I graduated from Wayne State and moved to Tennessee in 1995 with my ex-spouse and our baby girl, who's now almost 30 years old. But and he talks about the spokes of a wheel. The inner part, there's roads, different main roads going out like spokes of a wheel. From the inner part of Detroit. But a lot of this book takes place in what now they call Midtown, also called the Corridor. And that's the neighborhood I lived in. I hoboed around even from apartment to apartment then. And I attended the university there. And there's all kinds of famous landmarks and icons. And my former professor from Wayne State University will be our guest next week on the call. Peter dropped out of Michigan State, and he never went to college. And he was a very finished college, I should say. He was a very successful radio DJ on multiple rock stations in Detroit, and had an illustrious career as a radio celebrity in Detroit, in addition to his work in activism as portrayed in the novel. And when I think of Detroit Rock City, I think some of you might have thought something very different. There's the Kiss album that was recorded at Cobo Arena. I saw Green Day play at Cobo in the 90s, when punk became pop in the mid 90s. Actually, the opening band stayed at my house from that show. I lived in kind of a punk rock co-op house towards the end of my time in Detroit. But I think a lot of times we think of the baseball teams, the Tigers, the Pistons, the Lions. We think of the kind of the muscular rock of Mitch Ryder. That's a Mitch Ryder album cover there, Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band. There's a certain kind of macho rock that comes out of Detroit. Now, there's definitely like a lot of swagger in the book, maybe what even one would call toxic masculinity. You might even say some of the book's a little bit sexist, and I don't believe that's wrong of the time, that even the counterculture had aspects of sexism in there. But this image from this Mitch Ryder, has kind of got that Harley Davidson vibe, the American flag, the big old car, the wild lettering of the city of Detroit. This is kind of the vibe of Detroit, of that I think Detroit Rock City, that I think a lot of you probably have. And it's hard to separate it because we're all growing up, and some of our family members and friends and fathers worked in the car industry. Even we moved up there, and because some of my dad's clients my dad was a consultant, but some of his clients were in the auto industry, and his company wanted him to be in Detroit because of this boom of this industry. The Motor City is called the Motor City for a reason. And so these things are just, vibrating, out of the streets, the cars and everything. But there's something completely different, about this story. I did want to say, by the way, and this is absolutely incredible to me, as I was reading the book a year ago when it came out, and I got an early draft. And so I had it on a PDF file, and I downloaded it to my Kindle, and I was reading this thing. And I couldn't believe how many bands actually get mentioned just in the pages. Musical artists and bands get mentioned. Going to the Grandy Ballroom, I'll mention that in a second, to see, Janis Joplin and MC5 and Cream is one story that he tells. And so I called him up and I said, Peter, this novel is a mixtape. And this kind of was part of how I got the idea for this class, was because the novel had a mixtape embedded in it. And he's like, well, I never even thought of that. So he and I collaborated and we made this playlist just for the book, which he's been promoting. He's been on perpetual book tour, for the last year, and he's been promoting the novel with this playlist as well. And so we curated this together based on all the music that's actually mentioned in the book. And so this idea of a novel and a playlist kind of co-joining really encouraged me and gave me the courage to do this class. And so I'll share that later with you guys as well, the playlist, and you can listen to it while you read the book. It's really it's quite an epic pairing here. So I just want to go through it. Some of you are already taking your American history, or you took American history in high school, and some of you have been widely tutored in some of these things about the 1960s, and some of you all have not. And I teach a class on Dr. King and a theology and rhetoric course, and I'm always amazed that some folks actually haven't ever really studied this period. So if this is your first deep dive into the 60s, I want to give you guys a wide view and a narrow view of the novel, but I want to give it the general view first. So one of the primary movements of the 1960s was the African American civil rights movement, the movement for Black civil rights. They started out using the term Negro was the term that was used, and they moved away from that. And in the 60s, they embraced the term Black, and Black was a term of beautiful and bold empowerment. It was not considered to be a derogatory term. It was called, the movement out of Oakland, California, that actually has roots in Mississippi here in the South, called the Black Panther Party. The Black Power movement. So two of the most prominent leaders of civil rights, both martyred by bullets, murdered in their active work, was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who's a Baptist preacher from Atlanta, Georgia. And he was a great champion of nonviolence. He was tutored by Mahatma Gandhi from India and Henry David Thoreau from the Northeast. And he practiced passive resistance or nonviolent resistance. He also became a great champion of world peace and global consciousness. Minister Malcolm X of the Nation of Islam was a militant Black nationalist, and here they are pictured together. And I think today, in retrospect, many Black Americans who celebrate the freedom struggle and many white Americans who are in solidarity with the freedom struggle see the two as different venues and different aspects. They don't see them as opposed, but at the time, Minister Malcolm was quite critical of Minister Martin, right? He said it's time. Malcolm was famous for saying, it's time to stop singing and it's time to start swinging. And so this idea of political violence by the people who believe themselves to be oppressed is a big story of the 1960s. And I think sometimes we gloss over that tension between King and Malcolm and the tactical decision between violence and nonviolence, because one of the things that's quite shocking about Peter's book is how much violence there is, and I'll talk about that throughout today's lecture, because that's something that I'm wrestling with as I read this book. And full disclosure, I'm a Kingian. I'm a pacifist, actually, an actual pacifist. Like I've never owned a gun, and I've been beaten up before. I've lost a few fights, but I don't hit back, and that's a personal choice that I've made in my life. I'm not claiming that that's right for everybody. And self-defense is, I think, a moral option for people. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit this morning as I frame the entire context of the novel we're reading. But I want to give you the big view, and I got to keep going because I've got several slides that I've prepared. I spent a ton of time getting ready for today's lecture because I really wanted you all to see the breadth and the depth of the counterculture from which this novel emerges, and some of its Detroit aspects as well. And so here's a major iconic image from the anti-war movement of peace protesters placing flowers in the ends of guns. And one of the major things, and you have to think about this because these were people your age. Now, some of you have known people who are just a little bit older than you who have served in the War on Terror. Now, the War on Terror lasted 20 years. It was the longest war in American history, and we withdrew our troops from Afghanistan just last year, and some people considered that to be the end of the 20-year war on terror, though we still have troops, deployed all over the world. And some people have considered the United States to be a war government, a permanent war government. And we have a tension right now in Eastern Europe, in the Ukraine and Russia, and there's a possibility of a war beginning this week, a new war, starting just as the old war had just ended. So maybe growing up, you heard about September 11th. Maybe you heard about the war in Iraq. Maybe you have family members, older family members, maybe even some of you parents who've served in the Iraq War. And we had Iraq War veterans from the Iraq War of the 1990s. So, but when there was a mandatory conscription or a mandatory draft going on, one of the main objectives of the youth, and this is people your age, is that it was to get out of serving. And there was many different ways that they got out of it. Now, some people went, some people died. Many people had a neighbor on their street they know that died in the war. But many of them were what was called a conscientious objector. And that's somebody who went with their minister and was able to get official permitted a relief from combat. And then they had to serve in what was called alternative service. They had to serve their country, but they did it in a way that did not involve combat due to their moral inability to serve in war. And then you had people who were called draft resistors, and they resisted. And full disclosure, my uncle, my daddy's little brother, Paul, was of draft age, and he was a draft resistor. He ended up not having to do any time in jail, but some draft resistors did spend time in jail. But the thing that's difficult to talk about the 60s is that the peace movement was not all kumbaya, not all love and rainbows. There was the love aspect. The summer of love was very much real, but there was many of the peace activists who were so upset and so distraught about the war and seeing their friends die in the war that they actually thought that there should be a war here in the United States. They called that bringing the war home. And I'll talk about that. And the book really addresses that problem. These are just some figures. The asterisk figures are definitely estimates, and there are highly debatable topics. But the first figures are a little bit more accurate because of the fact that they were American service people. So the top number is the number of American service people who died in the Vietnam War or that are named on the Vietnam War Memorial in DC. If you've never seen that in DC, it's an epic and heartbreaking and very important part of our history. The 3 million is an estimate of the number of Vietnamese casualties from both the North and the South, and both combatant and non-combatant, casualties. The bottom, the 4,000 number is a known U.S. military casualties in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I believe that actually might just be the Iraq War number there. And then the second number there is an estimate of civilian non-combatant casualties in Iraq. That's an estimate. But the only point of me showing this is that these are all humans. And if you're a religious person, each one of these human beings is an image bearer of the Creator. Each one of these is a person endowed with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are God's kids. And the human cost of war, whatever your belief about the politics of each of the individual combat adventures, we acknowledge the loss of life, American and enemy loss of life. And I don't like those words, enemy, to be used. I'd like to live in a world where I had no enemies, but I only do that by practicing my spiritual practice of nonviolence, and it's an impossible task. I'm terrible at it. I'm no good at being a peacemaker because I have anger in my heart. So, but I try. I work on it every single day. But there was a great religious component, and I wanted to just give this a shout out. I know we've talked about this briefly in this course, and I will talk about it again. I've got a lecture devoted to this topic, also related to the counterculture. I've dear friends with two hippies from Cookeville, two counterculture hippies from Cookeville, who are also devout Christians, and I'm going to talk about them at length at a later lecture. But the resistance to the war in Vietnam included a very strong religious component. Top is Father Daniel Berrigan, a Catholic war resistor, and they were involved in a very strong action where they went to one of the draft boards and they took some of the paperwork out of the draft board, and they set it on fire. So they did property destruction of military paperwork involved in the draft. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, you know, and then the Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh later became very well known in what's known as the mindfulness movement in the United States. And he was a Buddhist who was outspoken against the Vietnam War. And several Buddhist monks committed suicide as an act of resistance to the war. They set themselves on fire. That's a very strong kind of resistance to war, very controversial. Suicide itself is very controversial. There were a handful of United States activists who committed political suicide against the Iraq War over the years. Somebody drove to Ground Zero and killed themselves at Ground Zero not too long ago. At the time, today we have a military that allows LGBT Q and T persons to serve. We allow women to serve in combat. We have women in the military. We have women high ranking in the military. But at the time, it was men were in the army at the Vietnam period, and women got very, very involved. And now some people might think it's kind of sexist or a little bit weird, or very heteronormative. And so I'm not claiming any endorsement of this. I'm just trying to tell you all the story. And this is an area of my academic expertise. And I'm a peacenik, so I've participated in some of this stuff. I full disclosure, but I'm not the poster at the bottom was very popular. Then girls say yes to boys who say no. But you know, I mean, whatever, you know, right? So top right, Joan Baez, American folk singer, who was very involved in this movement, actively involved in this movement, and for a while was married to a draft resistor who was actually in jail. And this is her performance from the legendary Woodstock concert, where she talked about her friendship with her draft resisting husband who was in jail. And these are women burning the draft cards of their husbands and sons and lovers in the other picture. One of the most, and this is very important because there's a myth. Now, I'm not saying that this never happened, right? That there wasn't a peace activist who was disrespectful or mean to a U.S. war veteran. I'm not saying that didn't happen, but the myth is that the peace movement hated the veterans. And as an overall myth, that is a lie. I'm not saying that individuals didn't do mean, stupid things, and I'm not endorsing that or encouraging that, but I'm telling you, by and large, the veterans were a major part of the peace movement. In the book, Werbe talks about them sending leaflets and newspapers to GIs. Who should be against war more than anybody than the soldier? So I've always said I'm against war. I'm not against the warrior. And I can think of certain circumstances where even though I'm not armed, somebody who is armed might defend my life. I am nonviolent. I will take a punch and not return it. But I could see a scenario where somebody who does practice self-defense might defend me. And so I don't criticize those men and women who have chosen that career path. I've been friends with them. I've had students, many students who are war veterans. But in the Vietnam period, especially, a large component of the anti-war movement were themselves veterans. And actually, that's true in the Iraq wars as well. There are many Iraq war veterans who are part of the peace movement. So this has always been part of our culture. My father, who served in the Illinois National Guard, is a member of my father's past was a member of a group called Veterans for Peace, and they've been around forever. This is one of the largest anti-Vietnam War protests, called the Moratorium Day in 1969. I found something so cool yesterday about this Moratorium Day, that there was a huge concert that happened that day with a lot of the people that I knew, but I never knew until somebody told me this. At that concert, Earl Scruggs and Charlie Daniels. Now, Charlie Daniels became very much on the conservative side and would not have been, probably he might have reneged on it later, but Charlie Daniels, Devil Went Down to Georgia, Charlie Daniels, and Earl Scruggs, Earl Scruggs, drove all the way from Nashville, Tennessee to this march and performed in this peace march, and were very supportive of the goals of the peace march. And I've got a little video clip I'll share with you all later of Earl Scruggs at the peace march, talking about why Nashville and country music. And again, this is this stereotype, you know, that everybody who lives in Tennessee believes one way and everybody up north believes another way. That's just not true. It's not true. I mean, there's very would have been very pro-war people up north, and there were also anti-war people, you know, in the South. My friends from the Wesley Foundation, who I'll talk about again later. They tell a great story of all the students here at Tech debating this topic openly. And there being ROTC kids and anti-war hippie kids in the same room talking about this topic openly and having a meaningful conversation about that. That's what college is for. And I'll tell more of their story later on at another date. My Tech alumnus friends who were there. They were there. So this is the art of Gary Grimshaw, the poet. I believe he's mentioned in the novel, but he made all the posters. I'm sorry, I called him a poet. Poster artist. He made all the posters for the concerts in Detroit, and including this redo of the Detroit Love-In poster on Belle Isle. Belle Isle's mentioned in the novel. They've had car races there. They've had boat races. They've had all kinds of exhibits. They used to have a zoo and an aquarium. I don't know what the status of all that is, but it's like New York has Central Park, like Nashville has Centennial Park, like Cookeville has Dogwood Park. Detroit had Belle Isle. Belle Isle is the major park of Detroit, and they had a Love-In out there and the MC5 is the leading band of the movement kind of that is depicted in the book. Now, a lot of the hippie rock is kind of mellow. The Grateful Dead can be very, very mellow. A lot of it's kind of jam bandy. If you've ever heard of like Fish or Widespread Panic or bands like that, it can be a lot of folk music like Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan. Today, whatever you might listen to, I don't know, the Avett Brothers or, Jason Isbell. Folk music and country are very adjacent today. But a lot of the rock that they were listening to was really hard rock. And the MC5 were a heavy band. But you can see from the artwork, the whole vibe of the psychedelic period is depicted in the artwork. So there's our author. These photos are taken by Lenny Sinclair, and they are taken from her book called The Motor City Underground. It's a massive coffee table collection of her photographs. And I bought the book, paid my dues to Lenny. So hopefully she got a little bit of the money from that book as I'm sharing these pictures in this. Same with Grimshaw. I've probably bought Grimshaw posters before. So here on the left is young Peter at the Love-In, and you can see, he's got the beads and, he's got the balloon and everything. And that's a very mellow, happy picture. And then there's, Peter in a gas mask, and that's not a COVID mask. That's, there was going to be tear gas in the streets during the rebellion. That's the central act of this novel during the massive Detroit uprising of 1967. And, they were trying to protect themselves from all the smoke. I mean, there's smoke from the buildings being burned down, and there's smoke from the police tear gassing people and such matters. But that's the contrast. That's the uncomfortable contrast that this book depicts. I don't think John is named in there, but adjacent to this movement and in the same neighborhood is my dear, dear friend, poet. I've already read one of his poems about blues on this class. Dear, dear friend, Grandpa John Sinclair. He was a freedom fighter for marijuana legalization, and it's now legal in Detroit and Michigan. And he actually went to jail for marijuana, and actually one of the Beatles, John Lennon, played at his freedom rally when he was in jail. That concert movie is on the YouTube, the John Sinclair Freedom Rally 10 for 2. But he was the manager of the MC5 and the minister of information for the White Panther Party. I'll explain that a little bit more in just a second as I slowly trip my way through this story to get to my conclusion. But he had this phrase, total assault on the culture. And they believed that you could turn everything inside down and up, inside out and upside down. You could flip everything, and they were flipped out. And to this day, MC5 are a major musical artist, respected, widely respected. I got John to do a poetry reading years ago at the Basement in Nashville, and they put together a blues band off the streets of Nashville musicians just to jam. We just wanted to jam with the great John Sinclair, and they showed a documentary movie about the MC5. Just an amazing history. So you maybe have heard of the Black Panther Party for self-defense, but these guys decided they were done with Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolence, and they were going to embrace the Second Amendment, and they bought guns. Now, one of their most famous marches that they had was in California. California governor at the time was Ronald Reagan. You've probably heard of him. He was a conservative president of the United States from 1980 to 1988. I grew up in the Reagan years. We were all very aware of Reagan. He'd been an actor, been the governor of California. Ronald Reagan hated all this stuff. I mean, he hated all these kids. He hated the hippies. But when the Black Panthers had a Second Amendment march with their guns in the state capitol, the Republicans wanted gun control. Now, I'm not taking a side here. I promise you, I'm not taking a side. I've told you I'm not into guns, but that's just me. I'm not judging you all. When I had property out in DeKalb County, I let people hunt on my property. I ate the meat that they hunted. So I'm not like a super purist, about this. So I don't eat meat anymore. It doesn't set well in my tummy, by the way. Vegetarian, happily so. But we've had a lot of open carry marches, a lot of Second Amendment marches in the United States. But the myth is that one side is going to come and take your guns away. Well, it was the other side that wanted to take your guns away. I just want to be very, very clear. It was the conservative Republicans who wanted to take away their guns. I'm just saying that's what happened. Look it up. It's facts, right? And so what happened is in Detroit is these group of hippies got together and they said, well, we can't join the Black Panthers because we're white. But we're going to be the Black Panthers for the white hippie community, and they were called the White Panther Party, and that is adjacent to this novel. And so they were into like, we've got our guitars and we've got our guns, and it was flamboyant as all get out. But looking at the scenery around our world today, we're seeing a lot of political violence. There was political vandalism just in Cookeville just this past weekend. Windows were broken. So we're living in these times, and I can run and hide under my pillow and my rock and just pray for it to all go away. And some of you probably are like, I wish it would all go away. You're too young to deal with this. You just want to have like a normal young adulthood, and there's a pandemic and there's a war going on, in our own country, right? So I'm just telling you what happened in the 60s. Maybe you can learn something from this novel and from the story because it applies, to our times. In which we're living. So when John was in jail, that's Yoko Ono and John Lennon. Of course, John Lennon died from a bullet when he was just 40 years old in New York City in 1980. I remember where I was, the day that John was shot. But in the 70s, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the University of Michigan, you've probably heard of U of M, at least in terms of sports. They're a major player in NCAA athletics. Ann Arbor was just down the road when I was in high school. I'd moved up there from Ohio. I wasn't really a Buckeyes fan, but it was like part of my education that I had to go to Ann Arbor. And we loved to go to Ann Arbor to hang out on the streets around the campus. We loved going to all the coffee shops and restaurants and bookstores and record stores and hippie stores. And I remember going to the Ann Arbor Art Fair, and it was in the 1971 in Ann Arbor at the big arena where the Wolverines basketball team would play. They had a freedom rally, and there John Lennon from the Beatles came and wrote him a song for John Sinclair called "Free John Sinclair." And there they are. I believe that's the actual picture from the freedom rally. Peter, of course, was involved in this newspaper, and it was like we have the internet, and anybody can be a political commentator. Anybody can have a podcast. Anybody can have a blog. Anybody can have a TikTok. Anybody can have a Twitter, a Facebook. And if you get enough followers on your Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, you can be an influencer. You can get out there and you can spread the word. Well, kids were making their own newspapers. We didn't have any of that internet then. They were making their own newspapers, and they were selling them for a dime on the street. Yeah, these were a dime. It looks like it went up to 15 cents, and so if you had some spare change and you were at a concert or a rally, you could buy one of these street sheets. That was called the Underground Press, and that was a major part of this novel. Major part of, and Peter still publishes. The magazine has changed over the years, many different times in terms of the natural nature of its content, but he's still publishing it out of his house in Oak Park, a suburb of Detroit, where he lives with Marilyn and Paul and Michelle is Peter and Marilyn in the book. The rebellion happened. A party was shut down at a Blind Pig. A Blind Pig is an after-hours music establishment. A party was shut down by the police where they were celebrating an African-American veteran who had just gotten home from Vietnam. And the altercation with the police erupted into violence. And for several days, the city of Detroit burned. And we never recovered. I mean, now they're saying we recovered. I was at home for a concert a couple of years ago, and I was told by an Uber driver that it was because they finally got a white mayor again. That's why Detroit was recovering. I mean, the things that people will say, You know, it happens that the Detroit mayor currently is white, and it does happen that there has been an economic revival in Detroit, but there are still parts of Detroit that have not recovered. And when I was there in the late 80s and the early 90s, I could ride my bicycle into all kinds of wild places. That was like the ruins of an ancient civilization, and the grass was growing, and people have started farming. There's huge urban farming movement in Detroit, and there's lots of different takes on this and what it means and all that. But that's the story of my city, and I love my city, and I'm very sensitive about my city, and I'm very homesick for Detroit. I love Tennessee. I've lived here for 30. Oh my gosh, have I lived here for 30 years? I've lived here for 25 years, going on 30 years, 27 years. I don't know, a long time. I've lived here a really, really long time, longer than I've lived everywhere else. So these are just some historic pictures from the rebellion. And so I've tried to give you a panoramic view of the cultural moment that brought us to this novel. And I hope you'll read it, and I hope I've helped you all understand some of the complexities and nuances of the book just a little bit better.